from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I would like to welcome you to the third program in our series entitled Facing the Threat. I want to tell you that today we are going to deal with a sub-area of that issue, and it's called the Freeman movement. I want to especially thank the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment for providing our guest for this special series we're doing due to a conference they held at Gonzaga University in the month of October. I'm very pleased to welcome two guests today to our program who are most qualified to discuss the question of the Freeman movement. I first welcome Ken Toole, who is the program director of the Montana Human Rights Network, and Ken has also been very involved with the Northwest Coalition over the years. And Ken, you go way back in time with me, and I'm glad to see you again, and welcome back to the state of Washington. And we're happy that you are here and on this program of the North Idaho College Public Forum. And our second guest is Chris Kaufman. She is the research director of the Montana Human Rights Network, and she is also a board member of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. And Chris, it's a pleasure to meet you, and we thank you for coming and participating here as we interview both of you at this conference in Spokane. Ken, may I start the program with you by asking you to bring us up to date a little bit on the Montana Human Rights Network. I know you're one of the founders, and I'm going to get into the question with Chris concerning the Freeman movement and you too. Tell our viewers a little bit about when it was founded and how it has been operating since that date.
Well, the network kind of began its formation in the mid-'80s because of white supremacist activity in northwestern Montana and also in eastern Montana, but didn't formally incorporate until 1990 when a number of local human rights task force got together and formed a statewide network. Since that time, we have now grown to 13 local affiliates in communities as small as 500 and 600, all the way out to the major metropolises of Montana, which are around 100,000 people in Billings and Great Falls. So the network is now pretty well established. We're an affiliate organization with local groups and local activists, staff of 6 to 7 people depending on the moment you ask a question. So.
Well, it's been very successful. You have an annual conference, and I believe that just recently took place.
Right. Yeah, we've been increasingly over the years concerned about public education and the attack from the religious right on public education. And our conference this year was on that topic, and we were trying to bring a focus to people about the interrelationship between public education and free democracy, and we see them as absolutely essential to each other. And so that's what our conference was focused on this year.
We're now going to ask Chris Kaufman to start us out with what our topic is today. In Idaho, and for those viewers over here in Spokane, and this area in particular, we've heard a lot about what's gone on in Montana recently, and of course it's not just we hearing about it, but around the country. Would you start us out by saying, how old is this particular movement, and how has it evolved to be to where it is today?
Well, the movement actually has roots that go way back, you know, into the Ku Klux Klan and the paramilitary organizing that was going on around the Klan. But more recently, one of the things that was going on when the network was just forming in the late 80s was organizing called the Posse Comitatus, which was a white supremacist paramilitary structure that had a theory about Jewish control of the banking institutions, sort of common anti-Semitic theories of the day. And they were selling that to farmers and ranchers that were having trouble, making it in their operations at the time. And local groups around Montana were picking up the activity, kind of strange activity of folks associated with the Posse Comitatus. And particularly in the late 80s, a fellow named Leroy Schweitzer, kind of one of the the leftovers from that Posse Comitatus organizing that was actually going on through the 70s as well, was filing lots of documents in the court, just kind of frivolous documents that didn't make a lot of sense. He'd proclaim himself to be a free white man, as well as filing various liens against public official property, and so he kind of had a gathering that he was training people, and we kind of lost sight of Leroy for a while, but he again appeared around in the early 90s, 91, 92, and continuing with the same kind of activity, and eventually gathered this group around that was called the Freeman. And they had holed up on a ranch in eastern part of Montana, and a lot of people know the story that they've heard from there. But it's not an isolated event. It didn't just happen in March of 1996 when the FBI moved in, but there was a long history of several decades of that kind of organizing. And also, it's also not unique to Montana. This is an organization that has roots and history not only throughout the Northwest, but across the country.
Wasn't there also some activity with that particular type of movement in the Midwest too, when there's in the early 80s and other places there was bankruptcies and so forth in some of the agricultural areas, and they were trying to take advantage of the frustration?
Yes, certainly. It didn't start as a Northwest phenomenon necessarily, but it had some activists out here, and those people still with that same kind of frustration, I think, were still hanging around and agitating in their own kind of ways. The difference of what happened, I guess, at Justice Township, as they named their little enclave out there, was that instead of pestering the legitimate court system with their frivolous documents, they were setting up their own parallel system of government. And this was an experiment that they were running, that they then brought in activists from around the nation. During those 4, 5, 6 months that they had set this up, they trained over 800 people, essentially franchised their movement, sold it. I mean, people paid a lot of money to come to these seminars. And now law enforcement and communities all across the country are going to have to deal with the impacts of this kind of organizing.
After that training. Ken, can you take us into some depth of what their doctrine is, what do they believe? Chris has done a wonderful job bringing us up through this movement and so forth, and some of the old roots that were there. But tell us some of their dogma, and I know they're quite anti-present government, aren't they?
They're quite anti-government. Their dogma is wacky, wacky, wacky. I mean, to most people, you read through the court filings, and it's kind of a smattering from Black's Law Dictionary with a little Latin thrown in and a healthy dose of white supremacy, all tossed into the local clerk and recorder, in which they claim their sovereignty. It really is, in many ways, pretty nonsensical, but there are some themes that run through it. And first is white supremacy, that these folks believe that there are two kinds of citizens. One they call organics, or sovereign citizens, which are essentially white Christian men, and other people they call 14th Amendment citizens, who derive their rights from the 14th Amendment, or the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, that says all laws apply to all citizens. The organics get their rights from God through the Constitution and the first 10 amendments. 14th Amendment citizens get their rights from government. Very different kind of levels of rights. One can be retracted by government, the other simply cannot. That concept of sovereignty and claiming their own sovereignty is critical to this movement, and this is why they won't get driver's licenses, they refuse to register their car, they won't use a social security number, because they see that as contracting away their sovereignty. And naturally that leads to confrontation with law enforcement. When these folks are driving down the county road with a freeman on a 2x4 for a license plate, that tends to result in conflict with local law enforcement. So that's one of the kind of founding political beliefs, but they also are a part of Christian identity. That within their filings, Christian identity is, as you know, is a racist theology that holds Northern Europeans are God's chosen Jews are Satan's spawn and everybody else is mud people, people with no souls. And you find identity throughout the documents that are filed by people in the freeman movement. Really, I think one way of looking at this movement, the so-called freeman, is that it's a subset of the hate movement. Their primary activity is political in nature using the judicial system, whereas you may see the militias as a paramilitary manifestation or wing of a set of ideology that has grown out of the hate movement. Christian identity is a theological wing of the movement that provides a basis for these bigoted and intolerant beliefs. The freemen really kind of provide the political analysis, and that's where we get the idea of setting up their own parallel government in which white Christian men are the only people with any real political power.
Chris, we'll come back to you. And Ken has made some comments that we've had on other programs on this special series, and we've been talking about different movements, not only in the United States, but in Germany and Canada. And each guest we've had, I've heard them using very common language that is a thread through almost all these groups. Would you agree with that, that even though they may have some different strategies or where they're emphasizing the political arm or theology, but a lot of the doctrine is the same with all these groups as they are trying to persuade people to their movement?
Yeah, I do think that's correct, and it's important to see this as a movement rather than just individual groups that are popping up. And one of the things that happened, as you may remember, with the Freeman standoff, as it was coming to conclusion, or actually throughout it, a variety of negotiators, quote, went in, and many of them with those same patterns of beliefs, that same system, racism, Christian identity, the 14th Amendment analysis, and so on. Those same people were going in and trying to negotiate on behalf of the FBI and bring them out. You had Bo Greitz, you had Randy Weaver, who tried to go in and was not let in, Jack McLam, Kirk Lyons, a number of these folks. And what they tried to do, essentially they went in with some kind of a fanfare, says we're going to bring them out because we understand these guys. And they didn't realize, I guess, how hard-heeled they would be in there. And they came out frustrated and then tried to say those people aren't really part of this movement. They're the extreme fringe. But as a matter of fact, just a few months before that, these people were the center of that movement. They were the educational arm, so to speak, training all these folks in this doctrine. So you have the same people trying to distance themselves because these people were lawbreakers, and they quickly saw how unpopular they were with the country.
So there became another political factor there, is if they're unpopular, you would have to disassociate. Is that what you're saying?
Well, these people are trying to build a political movement that can find something among the people that's acceptable. I mean, they want inroads into the legitimate political arena as well. And you see that in their access to Charles Duke and other people who actually are elected officials in this country. And they know if their ideas are so unpopular, they're associated with lawbreakers, as the country was seeing these freemen. So they want to, isolate the freemen and say these people aren't really part of this movement. And I think that's actually not true. This is all part of one big movement.
On something else on strategy, as there was attempts at negotiations, and Ken talked about earlier that they don't want to get a driver's license or license plate for their car and so forth. There's a defiance in almost every aspect of government. What happens in some of these groups' cases when the conflict is resolved to the point that people are arrested? They react that way too in the courts, do they not? How about legal counsel and all those issues?
I think what remains to be seen here is the impact that they're going to have on not only the court system but also the prison system. The freemen who have gone to court, since they've been arrested, have been disruptive. They've refused counsel, which of course they have a right to do. But they are also, going to be going into this political system probably for fairly short sentences. And while they're in there, they're going to come in contact with some pretty hardcore racists that are organized in the prisons, such as the Aryan Brotherhood. And I think what you're going to see is these freemen people hardened in their racist beliefs, at the same time influencing other people who are in there for robbery and the sort of the other kinds of offenses that people end up in jail with. There was already an instance in Montana where a fellow who's in for a drug charge said he wanted to get rid of his state or his court-appointed counsel and have a freeman represent him. You know, so they're going to have an influence in the prison system as well as the court system, and I think that's the whole angle we're going to be dealing with here in the next few months.
Ken, would you like to elaborate upon that too, about their tactics or the other tactics that I have not suggested in my question that you would like to pursue?
Well, I think that certainly what Chris is saying about the prison system and the justice system generally, it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. I think we're all familiar with the heavy emphasis that the racist movement puts on recruiting in the prison system, and what is going to happen here is political activists of a different type are going to be entering the correctional system, and that's going to be interesting. I think it's also very important to think about this mainstreaming aspect of these movements, because you have kind of the hardcore criminal folks like the Freeman out in Montana, like the Aryan Nation here in Idaho. In some regards, there's been criminal activity coming out of that area, while the group itself may not have engaged in criminal behavior. But there also is another tier of activism within this movement, and these are the folks who are consciously developing strategies to reach into the political mainstream. The militia movement is a great example of this, that a movement clearly that grew out of the racist movement, the Randy Weaver affair, populated by activists who had been associated with Aryan Nation, et cetera, et cetera. Now they get into the militia movement. All of a sudden they shed their racism and anti-Semitism, and they're a gun rights group. On the back of the Second Amendment, they're reaching out to people and bringing them into their organizations and introducing people then to conspiracy theories about the New World Order and who's behind it, and lo and behold, we come right back to the old anti-Semitic myths about the international Jewish banking conspiracy. There is a whole tier of these folks consciously trying to reach into more mainstream political movements, the gun rights movement, the religious right, even the wise use movement, actively seeking coalition around common ground to recruit and bring people into these more, I think what most of us view as rather bizarre political philosophies.
Now, when you say that they are shedding themselves from the white supremacy and so forth, to appeal to a larger group, are they actually just putting those ideas on the back burner till they can increase membership? And in other words, they're not rejecting the doctrine itself, but not using it as the main
I
platform?
think they consciously reject it. John Trockman, who, our whole indoctrination to John Trockman, when we met him in Montana, now leader of Militia Montana, the whole connection that we became concerned about was Christian identity connected to the Aryan Nation in the Idaho Panhandle. All of a sudden, as Trockman becomes active in the militia of Montana, he's not racist or anti-Semitic in any way. If you talk to John Trockman, they're absolute equal opportunity. And yet, the activism around hardcore racist groups and individuals remains. But as soon as he began to have success in the political mainstream around gun rights, he quickly shed that rhetoric and quickly began to deny it. And that wasn't just with white supremacy, he also did it with the Freeman. Wrote a long newsletter article about how the Freeman really understood the political process, they were really onto something, and that's the way to go. Then he got arrested in Muscle County. People in Montana were getting absolutely fed up with this Freeman garbage in eastern Montana. All of a sudden, John Trockman comes out and says, I don't know why the FBI doesn't get in gear and go get these guys. Well, then the Freeman turn around and issue an indictment on John Trockman. These are calculated political moves. This isn't that there are massive shifts going on and an internal re-examination of their beliefs. These are coldly calculated political moves. Boegright's the same way. He's up here with Randy Weaver and he gives his little Nazi salute to a bunch of skinheads. When confronted about that by the media, I'm not racist in any way, and I wasn't saluting, I was just kind of acknowledging their presence. the boldness of the fabrication sometimes is astounding, but it seems to work.
Chris, would you take us into that area that Ken is talking about? And in Idaho, because of some things that have happened by very, very small groups that, by the way, moved to Idaho, it was not native Idahoans that brought in that movement. Idahoans for a very long time have rejected the doctrine. The political leaders have rejected it. There's been a lot of laws passed in Idaho dealing with hate crimes, but yet Idahoans have felt a burden on their shoulders of a perception that was out there in the country that was an incorrect one, but they still had to, deal with that. Is there a similar experience that Montanans have just recently gone through with this publicity that you see around the country? And Ken has alluded to this. Tell us how the people of Montana have dealt with this incident and the publicity.
Well, Montana and Idaho, I think, are kind of known across the nation unfairly as states where racists come and live and hate states. And the people of Montana, as I'm sure Idahoans, reject the freeman, reject the militia. They do not have mainstream support at all in Montana. And, there's nothing special about Montana. Some people like to say, well, somehow people are attracted to Montana that have these wacky beliefs. But in large part, it's because groups like the Montana Human Rights Network and the Northwest Coalition are here pointing out every move that these people made, because we believe that the important way to respond is to shed light on the wackiness of their belief system. An interesting note about the Freeman situation in specific is that the townspeople right there in the local community were getting so fed up with the inaction of federal law enforcement, with the Freemen themselves and their defiance, that they actually were circulating a petition calling for roadblocks on the Freeman compound. They were ready to move in themselves if federal law enforcement did. And many people believe that's why the FBI acted when they did, that people in the community were getting fed up, and at least partly because the legitimate farmer that owned that land was not able to go on and get his crops in. And so I think they represent Montanans. We're fed up not only with the image, but with the activity of these kind of groups in our state.
That really puts the law enforcement in a very difficult position, particularly federal officials, when they have moved and there's been from that incidents where people were both in law enforcement on the side died. There was great criticism, and yet at the same time, when they're patient and wait a long time, there's criticism. From your expertise, I know that your area is dealing with the human rights issues, but how does law enforcement deal with these particular situations when sometimes those that are involved in that movement set up a situation intentionally, apparently, to have confrontation of some form? Is this a challenge in the future for law enforcement?
I think that's one of the big lessons that law enforcement needs to figure out how to deal with. We were fairly critical of law enforcement inaction in Montana. These folks, had outstanding federal warrants, a number of them for months up to years, and basically they were allowed to sit on their farms and ranches or cabins or wherever they were and defy law enforcement. Local law enforcement in Montana really doesn't have the resources. They're outmanned, outgunned. There was not really any way for them to go in there and move, but I think there was a responsibility there for federal law enforcement to move faster in bringing this situation to a close, because the result of that is that law enforcement agencies now all over the country are going to be dealing with these people because they were trained in eastern Montana with the Freemen.
Ken, I'll follow up a question with you on that. Around the country, there have been different movements for individuals. There were warrants for their arrest, or they had defied laws, and because of their organizing efforts and political views and so forth, law enforcement has been concerned about how to move and when to do it, and that's what Chris is talking about. Is this going to be a challenge around the country?
Well, I think it's going to be a huge challenge, and I think it's important to recognize that law enforcement are a political entity and responds to political pressure. And we need to remember that while the freemen were sitting on the plains of eastern Montana, what was going on in the U.S. Congress was a concerted effort to strip power from federal law enforcement. And the partisan dynamic that entered the public debate following Oklahoma City, from our perspective in Montana, was really quite shocking. The jackbooted thugs comments out of the NRA, people like Representative Helen Chenoweth talking about militias as though this is some manifestations of the people's right to peaceful assembly. In that political environment, in the Weaver hearings that Senator Specter was conducting, in that political environment, our feeling, our belief, which we held then and hold to this day, that was primarily responsible for the hesitance of federal law enforcement to get involved in yet another big black eye. I think this is a very difficult question because on the one hand, federal law enforcement, all law enforcement has an obligation to protect the citizens' rights, even the citizens they're bringing into custody. On the other hand, bringing people into custody by its very nature is confrontational, risky, and contains some level of risk of violence and tragedy. I think it's a very tough balancing act, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that the partisan political swirl around the Oklahoma City bombing and around the political issues that various interest groups such as the NRA were grinding back in Washington, D.C., ground the FBI to a halt in the plains of eastern Montana.
I said before our program ended we want to talk a little bit about your Montana Human Rights Network and your educational component. Chris, can you tell us what you're doing to deal with human rights questions and issues with, I assume, not only education with the general public, but with schools?
The primary way that we work in communities is through local affiliates. And many of those are involved in public education issues. But we have 12 or 13 now affiliates around in communities in Montana. And they formed for a variety of reasons. I mean, their basic mission is to counter right-wing extremism in their communities. And that may take the form of the freemen out in eastern Montana, may also take the form of the so-called religious right attacking public schools. We see a lot of these kind of issues in the local government arena, which has really become something of a training ground for right-wing activists to gain some training and education about how do you influence the public arena.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt, but I have the signal that we're out of time. I want to thank both of our guests today for your discussion of the Freeman movement, and good luck to you at your conference. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the third week of our series entitled Facing the Threat, the Freeman movement. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we will discuss the subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.